Well, good day, and welcome to the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association's podcast series, Building Opportunities. I'm Jeff Morrison, Executive Director at CHRA. Mon nom c'est Jeff Morrison, Directeur Exécutif à la CRU. This recently launched podcast series will offer interviews with innovators from across Canada's affordable housing sector who are working on new projects, partnerships, and policies in support of affordable, social, and supportive housing development. This Series 1, Episode 1 of the Building Opportunities podcast will feature an interview with President and CEO of the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation, Evan Siddall. Now, before joining CMHC in January 2014, Evan served as Special Advisor to the Governor of the Bank of Canada and the bank's Senior Representative to Toronto, where he led projects designed to promote continuous financial markets and the future stability of the Canadian financial system. He's also held a variety of positions in both investment banking and general management, including at BMO Nesbitt Burns, Goldman Sachs, and Lazare Frères. So welcome, Evan, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Il me fait plaisir d'être ici avec vous ce matin au site web.
Thank you. Well, today's podcast is a bit unique in that we've actually solicited questions from our members for you today. We received a large number of questions, and unfortunately, time is short, so we can't get to them all, but we've refined and consolidated a number of those questions. So let's get right to it. And let's start with, obviously, the biggest development from CHRA's perspective in housing, and that is the National Housing Strategy Consultation. Since the summer, CMHC has been very actively engaging with Canadians and stakeholders on the consultation. And Evan, can you tell us more about the process to date and describe for us some of the next steps and the key timelines associated with the consultation moving forward?
Sure, Jeff. As you know, CMHC was asked by the Minister Duclos, to lead these consultations through the summer, and we've of course done that since the end of June. That includes the launch of a website, letstalkhousing.ca, parlonslogement.ca, through which we've contacted over 1 million Canadians, received many thousands of responses to our survey, uploaded many submissions, including, I would note, CHRA's submission I gathered this morning, for which I thank you very much. And we've also had expert roundtables and a stakeholder event, as well as some consultations with Indigenous people and focus groups with people who we think are a little underrepresented in the conversation. And so we've in fact reached out to them. The consultation process itself ends in fact quite soon, on October 21st, so 10 days to go. And at the end of November, on National Housing Day the 22nd, Minister Duclos will publish a What We Heard document, and that will share with Canadians a summary of what we've heard throughout the consultations, which have been extensive but not notionally or naturally abbreviated, unfortunately, because of the time frame. And then after that, of course, the question for government will be what policy changes and what strategy will obtain. And that work has started, as you can imagine, and will conclude with a cabinet conversation sometime late this year, the beginning of next year, and then the government will make some sort of announcement. That's up to them when they do it.
Right. So, une fois le déroulement de la stratégie, pensez-vous que les fournisseurs de logements sociaux et au but non lucratif peuvent s'attendre à une relation renouvelée avec le CHL?
Oui, bien sûr. La CHL va évoluer et nos relations évoluent aussi comme ça. C'est une question centrale pour nous de les consultations de la stratégie nationale sur le logement. C'est quoi le rôle à l'avenir pour la CHL? Donc, je m'attends que notre rôle évolue, comme je l'ai dit.
Merci. So I'd now like to focus on one of the key issues that our members keep referring to as with respect to the consultation, and that is the end of operating agreements, which are being faced by many nonprofit housing providers, of course, as you know. What has been the feedback that you have heard and that CMHC has heard from social housing providers experiencing the end of operating agreements through the consultation process to date?
Great question, Jeff, and of course central to your membership. We've heard, of course, some gratitude of the government's announcement after the budget that rent-geared income supplements would continue for the two-year period that was contemplated by the budget. And so, as you know, we've set aside some money, about $30 million in continuing subsidies for CMHC administered social housing. And then the question, of course, is what for the future? What we're hearing from folks is, I guess, three things. We're hearing importantly that the operating agreements themselves are unnecessarily restrictive, and so they need to change. And that's constructive. And so we need to find a new relationship, as you just asked me in French, between the government as represented by CMHC and social housing providers or nonprofit housing providers. And I think there's also an expectation that the funding level will continue, as opposed to social housing agreements or operating agreements need to be renewed as such. The relationship between the government and those providers needs to continue, albeit in a different way.
So, Evan, you just mentioned that you're hearing that the agreements are restrictive and need to change. Do you think that that could mean that CMHC would be prepared to remove barriers in operating agreements? That we've heard from a number of our members and various housing providers that oftentimes there are barriers that prevent them from being able to pursue alternative financing options, divesting of properties in order to invest in new properties and so forth. Can you foresee the point where operating agreements would change in that regard?
Yeah, I certainly can. The specifics, I'm not sure. Of course, that's a decision for government. And I suppose there are two aspects to this, Jeff, that are important for people to know. First of all, we are restricted by government decisions in how we can operate. Those restrictions can change with the new government or new rules of the game. And then secondly, there's a matter of how we interpret our restrictions. And I hope your members know that CMHC has adjusted how it interprets those things where it can. And I hope that signals, in fact, it's intended to signal a client sensitivity with respect to the people we support. And of course, as a result of that, we were able to persuade the government of the logic of assisting with prepayment, and the $150 million prepayment program that was readopted by the current government, announced by the prior government. And that's underway. As you know, our first call for applications was in August, and there will be another call next February 17th.
Great. Well, and we look forward to communicating more information about that prepayment program to our members. Just a final question regarding end of operating agreements. Will you foresee funding being made available to providers to maintain the rent-geared income housing units once those operating agreements expire? As you know, rent-geared income units are extremely important for the many hundreds of thousands of tenants who live in social housing that wouldn't be able to afford any other option.
Yeah, so that we're getting into the particulars of the program, and it would be irresponsible of me to represent a future decision of government that I don't know. I will say that, of course, Minister Duclos signaled, importantly, the need to preserve those units through the additional $30 million of funding to support that for the interim two-year period. And I'm sure that he will maintain a focus on making sure that people aren't displaced as a result. How that manifests, Jeff, I'm not quite sure. But I suspect the objective that your members would have by the current government.
Great. Well, thank you. Just want to switch focus now to actually talk about the measures that were introduced in the 2016 budget, and you've referred to a number of those. That's, of course, the $2.3 billion over 2 years for various housing and homelessness initiatives that was announced in that budget. And I'm just wondering if you could describe or talk a bit more about those measures and how CMHC would prioritize and invest in the building of new affordable social and supportive housing for Canada's most vulnerable populations through that investment.
Sure. As you know, I'll break that down. So it was $2.3 billion, the first chunk of which doubled the existing funding under investment in affordable housing. That was about $500 million. And that is delivered through provinces and territories with the idea that there's some regional variability in programs, and we actually see that in how the money's spent. That results in a substantial amount of new construction. In response directly to your question, there was an additional roughly $100 million over 2 years for Northern and the Inuit regions, a further $80 million for Inuit regions, and that's now being delivered through Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada directly to self-governing Inuit bodies in the north. There was $200 million for seniors, $90 million for victims of family violence, and then $574 million, importantly, for social housing providers to improve water and energy efficiency results, which really funds renovation and retrofit. Those were the priorities. The new construction in particular comes through IAH, the Northern Funding, Inuit Funding, Seniors Funding, and the shelters for victims of family violence. So we expect a substantial boost, economic boost for the economy, just in terms of jobs and activity, and then a boost for the sector in new spaces just over the 2 years. And in the second phase of the Social Infrastructure Fund, which we're working on right now, and which will reflect a manifestation of the National Housing Strategy, I'm sure we'll see substantially more over a period of several years in terms of new construction, as well as dealing with deferred maintenance in the sector.
And I suppose it's premature to ask, although I'll press my luck here.
You can always ask.
I can always ask, and ask if there's been any funding allocations that have been notionally allocated yet for the next phase of housing under the strategy.
What we saw in the last budget, so the short answer is not really, but the long answer is you would have seen in budget 2016 about $20 billion for social infrastructure funding over an 8-year period. And that would be allocated among a series of priorities, housing being one, indigenous peoples in general, and the nation-to-nation relationship that the government has announced, and then thirdly, early learning and childcare, as well as there's a green component to that, heritage funding, et cetera. So that divides among several priorities, including funding on reserve in general for indigenous people, housing, early learning and childcare, green priorities, heritage priorities, and I think I was saying that $20 billion, we could spend that in housing and have economically productive outcomes and socially productive outcomes. So there's a conversation going on right now about how much of that envelope would apply to housing versus other priorities, and I just don't have a specific answer for you yet. That'll be, of course, for the government to deliver.
Right. Juste une autre question sur le budget. Pourriez-vous offrir une mise à jour sur l'initiative de financement en matière de logement locatif abordable. C'est ça. Quels sont les critères utilisés à l'évaluation des projets et à quoi ressemble le calendrier pour le reste de l'année?
Oui, nous n'avons pas déjà reçu l'approbation finale du gouvernement pour ce programme-là. Nous espérons de le lancer bientôt, en avance de mi-novembre ou la fin de mois de novembre. Mais je crois que les critères pour l'initiative de financement seront similaires de celles que nous avons annoncées concernant le fonds d'innovation. Par exemple, nous nous attendrons à ce que les projets que nous appuyons construisent un minimum de nouveaux unités de logements locatifs abordables et qui durent pour certaines années. Je m'attends qu'il y aura certains critères d'ajouter comme l'accessibilité, viabilité de la modèle innovative, etc. Donc, on va voir après la décision du cabinet, après 1 mois, 2 mois, quelque chose comme ça.
Okay, merci. Just to switch topic focus for a moment, you mentioned earlier the focus on Indigenous housing as part of the consultation. And as you know, CHRA has a very active urban Aboriginal caucus whose mandate is to work for better housing conditions for urban and rural Indigenous peoples. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about CMHC's support to help improve housing conditions for urban and rural Indigenous people, both now under the current tools you have and what your vision is as part of the housing strategy for the urban and rural Indigenous population.
Thank you. So I'll start with now and I'll end with the future. The now is for Indigenous people living off reserve. The position of the government in the past and our authorities in the past has been to deliver that support through the investment in affordable housing. So it's effectively been devolved to provinces. And some provinces prioritize Indigenous housing and some less so. Of course, it's germane, it depends on the needs in the given province. We also, as CMHC, administer a program called Section 95 housing, which is kind of a loan-to-own program. And it's about $125 million a year, and we build about 7,000 new homes every year on reserve. And our folks are very proud that we've increased that from 400 or 500 homes a year to 700. Again, in the category of being client-focused and making a difference. In the future, I imagine that can change. Section 95 is a dated program. There's, I think, on the part of some communities, confusion as to whether INAC, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, or CMHC is the authority on housing on reserve. And so we've got to address that in a way that's more responsive to our client needs, and that's on reserve. We're engaged in substantial consultations of all Indigenous groups. We're leading consultations with off-reserve First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And then bilateral meetings have been happening through the summer and fall, jointly with CMHC, INAC, and our colleagues at Employment and Skills Development Canada. Finally, INAC itself is leading engagement with First Nations to identify, both at the infrastructure level and the housing level, what needs to happen on reserve. So it's rather complex, as you can imagine, with many, many communities, series of consultations, and we are specifically addressing our attention to on and off reserve housing needs with a view to what we can do differently. So you can expect some changes there.
Great. And, Evan, I know it's a bit early, but one of the recommendations that CHRA has put forth under the housing strategy consultation is actually the creation of a distinct and unique strategy for Canada's Indigenous peoples. And again, maybe premature, but would you envision a distinct strategy focusing on the needs of Indigenous populations?
So kind of. In the sense that you mean, yes. I'm not sure the government would announce it as such, as a strategy, but certainly there's a focused effort, as you can imagine, led by the Prime Minister's declaration that he aspires to a nation-to-nation relationship between the federal government and Indigenous people. And I think, therefore, it behooves us to give the government advice on how to do that with respect to housing, but of course, across the full spectrum of needs for Indigenous people on and off reserve. Whether it would be styled, the reason I paused, is whether it would be styled as a strategy or something else, I don't know. But a particular attention on that, absolutely, Jeff. I think we share that objective.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that we got from our members, and as you can imagine, our members are very environmentally friendly, very sustainable in their thinking in terms of housing delivery. And so one of the questions we got was whether CMHC will continue to promote sustainable community design principles and land use planning in your programs and in your policies that will ultimately reduce costs and environmental impacts with regard to social and nonprofit housing. Will that remain a priority for CMHC?
Yeah, it will. And you know that it was measuring improvements to water and energy efficiency that was driving the renovation, the renovation and retrofit program of $574 million this year and next. That's a way of reducing operating costs for the sector, certainly. We're also thinking about this from a people-centered approach, Jeff. So we think of sustainability, I guess, on three dimensions. Certainly, this question of environmental sustainability it's a responsibility of government. Economists call it an externality. It's too easy for private sector actors to ignore. But externalities like that are the responsibility of government to address, and we will continue to attend to that. Secondly, economic sustainability. We want a healthy nonprofit and social housing sector, and one that allows the finite resources of government to be directed to new construction as opposed to helping with groups that are having a hard time getting along. And so it's on us, and I mean us as CMHC and government, to help support capacity building in the sector to make sure that occurs. And then thirdly, social sustainability. And I think this is the thrust of your question, the idea of sustainable community design. Inclusive societies, ones where we don't have ghettoization of communities, ones where people have social mobility in terms of jobs, in terms of economic prospects, in terms of inclusiveness. I, like you and many people, probably watched this terrible display of democracy in the U.S. the other night in the debate. Canada feels like an island of social inclusion in a world that's lost its way a little bit, and I think that is a priority that we will reflect in what we're doing in the future. I know it is.
I think many of our listeners would agree with you on that.
I'm
Um,
sure.
so we only have a few minutes left, and Evan, I just wanted to actually get a little personal. And in fact, this was a question that was posed to us by a member, and we thought it was an interesting question. And obviously, at your time at CMHC, you've had the chance to meet with many Canadians, many housing providers across the country in many different settings. And I'm wondering if you could share with us uh, one or two of the key moments that have really had an impact on you in terms of your view of the challenges that Canadians are facing with respect to accessing safe, affordable, adequate housing.
Yeah, I'll tell you two stories. Both relate to Indigenous housing and both on reserve. And I know this will resonate with your membership. And I don't mean to confine my attention to that. It's just, I've said that the conditions on reserve can be abysmal. And some people said, "Really? You said that publicly?" Like it's even controversial. So when I first joined, I said, when I'm traveling, I'd really like to be able to visit reserves to First Nations communities, not having had the opportunity to do that. And of course, people naturally want to gravitate to success stories, and I saw some very successful communities, and that's heartening. But I said, I'm not getting a good representation of what this is really like and what the problem is, and I started to mix my experience. And and so our board actually met in British Columbia. This is the second part of the story, earlier this year, and we visited 3 communities. I won't name them because I'm going to make a discriminatory comment. I don't mean ethnically discriminatory. I mean capacity discriminatory. Among the 3, one extremely healthy, another getting by, and a third that's really having a hard time. So I met with Chief and Council. In fact, our board met with Chief and Council at the one that was sort of in the middle, getting by. And there was one of the members of council who leaned across. He was in a Section 95 CMHC home, and he leaned across the table at me. This big, burly guy. Like, you'd think he intimidates his kids, I imagine, his adolescent children. And he was almost tearing up, telling me how important it was for him to have a place to call home, and what it meant for his family, and what it meant for having people in his home for dinner, and his children studying. And it was I recognize these things intellectually, but to see the impact we'd had on that family's life, it stays with me even now, but it stayed with me vividly for a week or two. And that's why we do what we do at CMHC. It's why folks do what they do in your membership at CHRA. And I just want to confirm that that we're doing good work and it matters to people.
And I think oftentimes we need to remind ourselves about those individual stories and put those individual faces to the work we do, because oftentimes we tend to get lost in some of the big picture issues, but oftentimes reminding ourselves about those one-on-one stories and impacts that we all have are extremely important.
Indeed. Yeah, they're the fuel, right? They keep us going.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a number of issues that our members have addressed with us about the consultation. Are there any final thoughts or any key messages that you wanted to pass on to social and affordable housing providers across the country?
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for that invitation. Yeah, it will be under the category of innovation. And this is not me directing this at CHRA. It would be how I would answer this question with anybody. The current government, in particular Minister Duclos, is very interested in innovative solutions. So that sounds nice, but let me explain to you why it's important. I said in the past that the problem is heightened expectations, and you can imagine in these consultations, people of course put their wish lists on the table, and we expect that, and that's proper. We also need help thinking about how to maximize the return on the federal government's constrained fiscal resources. You asked me how much money is involved. It will be a substantial amount of money. It will not be enough. And so in order to help bridge the gap between enough to really address the total needs of Canadians in Canada and the amount of money that can be devoted to it, we really need help. Our aspiration is that we will ensure that all Canadians have access to housing that meets their needs and that they can afford. That's a grand aspiration. I'll tell you, here at CMHC, even with constrained funding, we're determined to try and get there. It'll take some time, but that's the objective of the National Housing Strategy, to help us uphold this commitment. and enable us to improve the lives of those in greatest need. And that's really where we're focusing our efforts, on aligning different levels of government and other actors, including private sector, nonprofits, and housing experts. And we're hoping that innovation from our ability to convene these conversations and put people together, and maybe programmatically, will help us. I hate the term leverage, but it's a good one. Leverage what won't be enough money into what hopefully can satisfy the need or get us to it. Right. So innovative ideas are crucial. We've got on our website an Ideopolis platform where people can submit innovative ideas, make them as crazy as you want them to be, and vote, and that will enable us to crowdsource good solutions, because for goodness sakes, we don't have all the answers.
Right. And I think, having listened to our membership over the summer preparing for our consultation, we've heard many innovative ideas at a grassroots level, things like seniors co-housing, home sharing, etc.
Yeah,
but also some really interesting high-level, macro-level innovative policies. And I'll make my pitch to say, Evan, I hope you have a chance to review our submission. It's been the product of many conversations with our members and stakeholders across the country. And I think many of them have taken the call for looking at innovative solutions to heart. And definitely that's formed the basis for much of our consultation response.
I will read it. You've taken the time to prepare it. Our relationship with CHRA is one of, I don't know if you know this, but we have a group of top tier or top first tier stakeholders. CHRA is of course one, and we take this relationship very seriously. The other thing I would say, and you asked me this question in French, let us know how we can get out of the way. Part of allowing innovation is to make sure that government policy and as manifest directly by government and through CMHC aren't the barrier. We talk about this internally, about spurring innovation from our employees. The key there is managers getting out of the way. And so by analogy, we're receptive to suggestions on that front, and on how CMHC's role can evolve to be more supportive of the sector.
Well, we very much appreciate those kind words, and of course, as a key partner for us, CMHC and our relationship with you and with the organization is fundamental, and we look forward to building on that. So unfortunately, time is short, so that's all the time we have for today. But je veux juste dire un très grand merci à toi, Evan, pour votre temps aujourd'hui. I want to thank Evan Siddall, the President and CEO of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, for joining us today in this podcast series. And Evan, as I say, we very much look forward to continuing to work with you and your colleagues as we flesh out this housing strategy and make it work for all Canadians.
Je vous remercie aussi, et bonne journée à tous et toutes.
Merci, and I just would add for our listeners, please visit us at www.chra-achru.ca for more information about CHRA's membership, advocacy program, and policy materials, along with upcoming webinars and podcasts. Merci encore. Thank you very much.
This has been fun. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Evan.